Many Christmases ago, my aunt and uncle decided that they were going to make Santa Claus a really big deal for my cousins. So they played it up big. They wrote letters to Santa Claus. They called Santa Claus on the phone. It was a big deal. Well, my youngest cousin, he asked for a Harrier jump jet for Christmas. Now, don't get me wrong, not a little toy. No, he wanted the full $30 million airplane as his Christmas present. But it wasn't just that he wanted this $30 million airplane. Somehow, in the matter of the weeks leading up to Christmas, he convinced himself that he was going to get this $30 million airplane for Christmas. So Christmas Eve rolled around. And as a family, we're sitting around, and the way we did Christmas is we usually go from oldest to youngest, starting with my grandma and working our way down. And you'd open up one present, and you just kept going in that cycle, opening up one present at a time. Well, the gifts began to dwindle under the tree. And we finally got to my youngest cousin, the last gift. The little small box didn't in any way dissuade him from believing that this must be the Harrier jet. As he unwrapped the present, the tension built. And as he looked at his brand new Fisher-Price fishing pole, the tears began to flow. And he proclaimed, "It's a stupid baby toy." He was broken because he had wrong expectations. He came into Christmas with an expectation that was a wrong expectation. Sometimes I think in our life, in our Christian walk, we don't have our expectations right or our desires right, or we're part of the wrong culture. So I want you to think for just a minute. Think back to a point where you've been disappointed. You probably have at some point in your walk. It happens to us. What led you to that level of disappointment? What we're going to see in Mark chapter 10, verses 32 through 45, is we're going to see a disappointing event with the disciples. And what we will actually wind up seeing is that there were really three factors that led the disciples into this position. That was, first, they had erroneous expectations. We'll see then that they had, defective desires, and finally, crippled culture that they were all embracing and part of. And this led them to this somewhat disappointment. So let's begin with verses 32 through 34. And what I want you to see there is the erroneous expectation the disciples had. Specifically, contrary to the disciples' expectation, the King of creation came to suffer and die. They expected the King of creation, the Messiah, but contrary to their expectation, the King of creation came to suffer and die. Let's read verses 32 through 34. They were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. "We're going up to Jerusalem," he said, "and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise." By the time we get to Mark 10, a lot has happened. In fact, Jesus has pretty definitively established himself as being someone special, the Messiah, the Christ. And we see here somewhat of a transition. Up to this point, Jesus has been sort of with the crowd, teaching, explaining things, doing miracles. But you get this idea of people around Jesus and him having these interactions. Here, I see him resolutely turning, facing Jerusalem, and heading in one direction. He had his mind set on something. And I think the disciples and those around him pick up on this. It says that they were astonished, and those who were following him were afraid. They realized something is going on. And they, in their minds, I think, this is the revolution. This is what we've been waiting for. He's going to throw off the shackles of Rome. The Messiah is coming, and we're part of it. That was their expectation. But what does the scripture say was really going to happen? Jesus says he's going to Jerusalem to be handed over to the chief priests, to suffer, and to die. He will rise again on the third day, but before that, there's this period of suffering and pain and death that's coming. This is the third time Jesus has actually predicted it. Each time the disciples kind of miss it because they had the wrong expectations. In our life, as we go through life, as we go through our Christian walk, we need to make sure that our expectations are consistent with what Christ has for us. That we're not having these erroneous expectations of maybe this grandness or this power or this influence, but rather that we have an expectation that might include suffering for Christ. That might be what we need to be looking at. So if you've been disappointed before as a Christian, maybe it was an erroneous expectation that led you into that. Let's go to the next point, and that is defective desire. So in verses 35 through 40, we're going to see the defective desires. Namely, contrary to the disciples' desire, the master and his disciples were going to suffer. Contrary to their desire, they were going to suffer. Let's read verses 35 through 40. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. Teacher, they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. What do you want me to do for you, he asked. They replied, let one of us sit at your right hand and the other at your left in your glory. You don't know what you are asking, Jesus said. Can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? We can, they answered. Jesus said to them, you will drink the cup I drink, and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. But to sit at my right hand or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared. So the defective desire, they had a desire for power. The two individuals that we read about here are James and John. You may remember from earlier in Mark, James, John, and Peter had a somewhat unique position with Jesus. They were the three that were present when Jesus raised a woman to life. They were the three that were present on the Transfiguration. They had gotten to see Jesus do miracles, but more than anybody else, they got to see that Jesus was God. And so James and John come up with a request. It's a pretty simple request. Let us be the ones who are with you in your glory. We want to be at your right and your left hand. We want to be there. There's a sense in which it's somewhat of a commendable thing. They are recognizing, they're acknowledging that Jesus is someone's special, God himself. But they're not acting on that recognition in the proper way. They have a desire for their own glory, for their own power. So Jesus gives them somewhat of a metaphor here, a statement. He says, can you drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with? Jesus is essentially asking them, are you prepared to fully experience what it means to follow me, to be my disciple? So I don't know about you, I hate the taste of cough syrup. I absolutely hate it. And so when I have a cold, I would much rather swallow one of those horse pills than have that flavor of that syrup running down my throat. I don't know, there's something about drinking something that you fully experience it. You just can't get away from it. If you drink something gross, it's gross. You can't avoid it. The same image is that of baptism, right? It's the full immersion. It's to completely experience it. I think Jesus is saying, are you prepared to fully experience what it means to be a disciple? I also think that there is some allusion to the coming ordinances of the Lord's Supper and baptism. But I think Jesus is really saying, are you prepared to fully partake in this? And they say, oh yeah, we are, absolutely. Complete naivety, right? Jesus says, you will. But to be those two people at my glory isn't something for me to give. That's already been prepared. So I'm going to take just a quick second and give you a proposition or a thought. I wonder if the two people that were at his left and right hand in his glory were the two thieves that were crucified alongside him. James and John weren't ready for that. They would suffer, but they weren't ready to fully follow him as a disciple, which we'll learn later in the book of Mark. I'm reminded of the story of King Midas. It's not a real, there's multiple versions of it, but the idea is that King Midas does something, and somebody offers him whatever you want, and he says, I want to be able to touch anything that I touch to turn into gold. And they give it to him, And so he touches his throne, and his throne becomes a golden throne. He touches his cup turns to gold, and he realizes, wow, this is awesome. Lots of riches here. Till he picks up his chicken and realizes it's now inedible gold. And what he had hoped for, his desire, was defective. It wasn't going to work. We need to make sure that our desires are not for grandiose things, but rather a desire for Christ, to follow Christ in what he has for us. The final thing that we see here, besides the defective desire, is going to be a crippled culture. So let's look at verses 41 through 45. And for the crippled culture, what I want you to pay attention to is that contrary to the disciples' culture, the Son of Man valued humble service over proud positioning. So contrary to the disciples' culture, the Son of Man values humble service. Verse 41. When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." The other disciples are quite indignant. I don't know what made them more mad, the fact that James and John had asked for this, or the fact that they hadn't thought of asking for it first. But they're indignant over this. How could James and John ask for this? What are they doing? They're trying to get all the glory for themselves. We have a problem in our culture, just like their culture. People like fame, glory, a title. I was doing some reading on a news article a couple weeks ago. There's this concept of what's called title inflation. I don't know if you've heard about this or not, but a lot of startup companies will give people really fancy titles in exchange for not paying them what they actually deserve. So, you've got the vice president of customer service when the department is one person. All these various fancy titles for people so that they will work for them because we can't pay them enough. We love titles. We love positions of power. We have a culture that loves power. Jesus says, no, this is not how you're supposed to be. He says, whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to serve, or to be served, but to serve. Jesus values service. Instead of this proud jockeying for position, and throughout this whole passage, as we started there with verse 35, when we started there, you get this picture of the disciples, trying to cut in front of each other or jump to the front of the line. I want to be first. And you see this even in previous chapters in Mark. I want to be first. I want to be the one that receives all the glory. Jesus says, no, that's not the way it's supposed to be. In the kingdom of heaven, the value is on the person who serves. In honor, preferring one another. In our Christian walk, we need to make sure that we value service. We need to make sure that we're not putting the value on the pride and positioning, but rather that we're putting the value on the service. I want to take a second. I want to walk back to my original example with my cousin and his birthday or Christmas present. If you think through what happened in that, the first thing that you'll notice is he shouldn't have actually expected the Harrier jet, right? That was not what he was going to get for Christmas. It was an erroneous expectation. But he really shouldn't have even desired it. He didn't have the ability to fly it. As an 8-year-old boy, there's no way he could have. He had a defective desire for this thing that he would never be able to use. But it was in part because he had bought into a crippled culture where he thought having this possession would make him really cool amongst all of his friends. So he had an erroneous expectation. He had a defective desire. And he bought into the crippled culture. So the question that I have for you is, have you been hurt by the church, by another Christian because of an erroneous expectation, or a defective desire, or buying into a crippled culture? We're all going to get hurt at times. People are going to do things that hurt. But we need to recognize that it really isn't about us and our proud position. It's really about following Christ in service. So, to close out, I want to ask you one question. Who do you need to serve this week in order to overcome these hurdles?